Module 3, Unit 1, System Components. In this unit, what we're going to do is to identify actually the components of a computer. We should be able to and we will explain each components and determine the performance on how to specify an appropriate computer system. And then we will also try to describe, pag-usapan natin about components, about function of a computer component from motherboard to processors, memory, and expansion bus. And then we will also tackle the importance of a cooling system on the components used within the computer. And then we will also identify the role of a PC firmware and access the firmware setup program, learn about how it functions and what is a PC firmware for. So to start with, guys, have you, when you're selecting a computer, what do you do? What is your basis? Ano yung ultimate goal nyo? Ako minsan, what I do is just, sometimes una akong tinitingnan is price. But you know what? It's somehow it's a lazy way, but sometimes it's not a smart way as well when selecting a computer. Basically, when buying a computer, there should be some basis, there should be some references. So the most important thing when selecting a computer is the performance of the key components. Yung mga key components, these are the vital components of a computer, that actually makes a difference from other vendors. This is actually yung basis na how actually computer is performing. So yung mga key components dyan is starting from the CPU itself, the central processing unit. You need to be aware, starting from what is a CPU. No? These are the things that we will discuss, and then in performance level neto, what are the terminologies, what are the technicalities behind a CPU. And then another important component of a computer is selecting the correct RAM. You need to know what kind of RAM, what type of memory, anong capacity that will match or is compatible with the hardware. Memory is very important sa computer system. And also the different types of hard drives. Ito yung mga fixed disk, ito yung mga permanent storage within the computer na has been introduced to us in the previous units. Meron tinatawag na yung conventional hard disk drive, and then the solid state drives or SSD. HDD, it's the typical how we use the acronym for hard disk drive. So selecting the right hard disk drive from the capacity, and then be aware of the specifications, ano yung ratings or specification ratings that we need to look at in line to the in line to the performance that we're trying to to achieve sa isang computer. And then another important factor is the graphics processing unit. Lalo na pag ang kung if you're looking for a computer that you will use in gaming or imaging. So that's why it stands for graphics processing unit, because it is a processor for graphics applications. So there are I would say it in a simple words na merong sub system or sub processing unit within the computer itself. Now very vital ito, no, because it helps give you rendering a realistic image or high resolution image in a computer. That's also a factor in as a component for identifying about the components of performance of computer. So when it comes to network naman din, guys, as you may already know, there are many kinds of network interface cards. This is significant sa when you are making your computers, ultimately connected to the network or to the internet. So there are actually two types, no? Merong wired network and the other one is a wireless network. Yung wired network, it uses an Ethernet port. Itong port nito, this is the Ethernet port. It is an RJ45. Dito natin pinaplug yung cable, di ba? And you can have it as a network interface card or yung network card mismo is built-in na sa CPU itself. You can find at the back of a computer or at the back of a laptop, meron ng port dyan. And if you want to add more ports, you can do this as well. So, a wired network, it involves a connector named RJ45. Yan ang itsura niya. 8 pins yan. 8 pins usually. Kasi kahit sa phone, meron tinatawag na RJ11 and it looks similar to this ang itsura niya. Not exactly. But yung pins niya is 8 pins ang RJ45. Ang RJ11, it contains from 2 to 4 pins. So that's the distinction. And sa unang tingin, medyo maliit dito. So again, going back to to this discussion, NIC, we also call this as NIC or network interface card. Meron iba, NIC card. Pag may manakausap ka na masyadong strict sa terminology, it's a redundant actually. And another network interface card for wireless networking, it looks like this. It's also an expansion card, but you have antennas and on mga modern computers na walang na meron ng built-in networking even for wireless na you don't even see the antenna. You don't see it anymore. It's a different wireless technology. Mga early days of networking or sa mga computer na walang that you want it to be wireless, ito ang ginagamit na interface card if you want it to be wireless. So you don't need to connect an RJ45 cabling or connector. And so it uses a radio at ISM. You don't need that, but ISM is industrial, scientific, and medical radio frequency. No, so it's a radio frequency RF, and then this is when you say wireless networking, it involves access points. Wireless access points actually, o WAP, tawag dyan, WAP. Asa ng WAP, asa ng access points, they're all the same thing. So, in system components, in using a system components, it's very important, di ba, na we know what are the key components, and it's also important to locate or identify the key components, especially or any components of a motherboard. This is, an example of a motherboard. When we say motherboard, ito mismo yung board sa loob ng computer where you can find where the CPU is. Ito yung CPU socket. Dito ini-insert ang CPU, ang processor. And this is where the memory module is being inserted. Ang tawag naman sa kanya is memory slots. So, it's either dalawang memory SIM slots and before, meron pa 4. Usually, dalawa. So, it has specifications, it has capacity, kung ilang gig ang memory, that's what you need to know. But this where the memory is. And meron din tinatawag na disk drive connectors. Ito yung mga IDE, SATA or SATA. You need to know where are those. And then this one, you see this? These are expansion slots, or they also call it adapter cards. May mga niyan, classifications, may kanya-kanyang specification, bawat classification that will only fit to these slots or it will only work to these slots. Yan tawag dyan. Mga expansion card slots din ang tawag dyan. And then at the back of the computer kung saan yung mga connectors, yung I/O ports, itong itsura niya. If you try to open and look at the motherboard, nandito yung mga input and output ports to connect, no, yung mga peripheral devices for video, audio, printers, and so on. So, yung processors, as I mentioned earlier na where we insert it in a CPU socket, and has been mentioned as well na ito yung mga key components, no? This is what it look like, yung front and back, and it's an electronic device or electronic component. It's a microprocessor actually, because it's all about microelectronics. I'm trying to word to say it in a simple term, ano? Kasi it's a processor, it executes commands, it executes instructions, but basically this is an integrated circuit. It is still an electronics at micro level. Kaya tawag sa kanya microprocessor because it uses smaller than microelectronics. So it's actually millions of transistors inside. And then it is also called as a CPU, or sometimes it is mistaken or mixed with CPU and yung processor, but CPU is where the processor is being installed or mounted, where you can find the processor within the computer. Yung buong computer mismo, yun ang CPU. And then ang popular vendor here or manufacturer, it's either Intel and AMD. Marami na rin mga manufacturer ng processors, but the leading ones para Microsoft and ano din yan, Linux or Android, Intel and AMD. So when it comes to Intel, no, nag-umpisa yan sa mga early days ng processor, mga 386, 486 na meron ng Pentium, may mga ibang variation, may mga Core processor, Pentium processor, Celeron, Atom, and then Xeon. And then yung mga AMD brands na yun. Ito, yung mga may mga legacy, yung mga legacy na processor, they call it Athlon, Phenom, Sempron, Turion, Opteron. Ang iba dyan, I haven't heard. But if you are really detailed, may mga website dyan that you can actually check. Ano yung mga recent at saka yung mga phase out na, or sometimes they call it legacy. And then meron din tinatawag na Zen microarchitecture. It's all about processors, no? And then for mobile computing, mga Ryzen, Threadripper, and Ryzen Mobile. And then Epic. Ito, to be honest, it's rarely that I could hear this because it depends on where you work. But now that we know, Epic is also another CPU brands that you will see in the market. And then, meron din tinatawag, guys, system components, yung tinatawag na ARM CPUs. ARM, not literally our arm. It's an acronym, guys. Now, when we say ARM, it stands for Advanced Risk Machine Microarchitecture. So ARM, no? Kasi this is another type of processor that can be found in a CPU. And also, actually, it is widely used on smartphones and tablets. Ito yung mga, instead of a CPU itself, instead of processor, they call it small CPUs or advanced RISC machine. And then your RISC machine actually, it stands for Reduced Instruction Set for Computing. That's a type of processor. So, minsan kasi may CPU na merong kailangan, actually, not minsan, CPUs that requires licensings kung ilang cores na specific sa mga processor. So, but when it comes to ARM, it doesn't, license for it, no? And then, you will see that yung mga Apple, Samsung, ang mga gumagamit niyan. So it's faster, it's a reduced instruction set. It's like yung mga instructions in a typical processor being executed, must improvise, reduce, instead of parang rephrased, no? Lesson procedure, lesson processes. So meron, and then it was also sometimes yung more complex, yung CISC, no? Complex instruction set, computing. These are another type of CPUs na when it talks about handheld devices. Na I mentioned, these are also computers. No, so ano bang features ng processor, or I would say function of a processor? So, di ba, alam naman natin na in a CPU, merong input, mga input devices, and then the output devices. No? There is three significant features that you need to be aware. Yun yung control unit, the execution unit, and then the registers. When we say kasi yung control unit, upon the input, a signal or a data coming into the computer, no? It is processed within the CPU. Meron tinatawag na control unit. Kinukuha dyan yung mga instructions, and then nandyan yung pipeline kung saan dadaan yung mga yung pipeline is like think of it as an information highway kung saan tumadaan pabalik-balik yung information. So, within the control unit, it's either ipapadala nila yan for example is for certain operations, arithmetic or logics, and then it goes back to the control unit para to give the data after processing it, and then it stores it to the memory. And then memory actually is just, it's also called in the processor yung registers. Ito yung mga temporary memory where you store the instructions or the commands being processed by the CPU. And then for execution or for output, i-retrieve ngayon ng control unit from the memory unit or from the registers all the informations, or any commands that needs to be sent out or to be processed in a display like monitor or to be printed in a printer. So, features niya. Remember, merong control unit where it all receives the signals coming from the input devices, and it processes it for certain operations, and then it saves it or store it. It's a registers, and then retrieve it again for execution or for delivery as an output signal, output data, again for monitor or printer. Yun ang overall or the summary of to understand how processor works by thinking about these features. Now, meron kasing, di ba, nabanggit din, even me, I mentioned about instruction set. And then when we say instruction set, meron 32-bit or 64-bit. Before anything else, instruction set is actually a command, a set of commands in one. So kaya tinatawag sa instruction set. These are commands that's being processed or that is running or being executed by the CPU. But it's been existing since the 8086 based machines before 32-bit since 1978. Ito yung mga 16-bit CPUs until mid 80s, and then yung mga 64 developed by AMD, just for historical purposes, just to let you know. And hopefully, who knows, but rarely na tinatanong yan, but just para lang din sa kaalaman nyo, since the late 70s, computers have been born, and CPUs have been utilized. 16-bit nagumpisa, and then after that, meron ng tinatawag na 32-bit. In 32-bit and 64-bit, it can of course much faster on 64-bit. Kumbaga, it can handle all the instruction set at the 64-bit. But this is important. What's important when we say 32-bit CPU, ang important thing to remember, it can only utilize up to 4 gig of memory. Hanggang dun lang yun. And then when we say 64-bit, it can up to address 16 exabytes. Meron nga ngayon di ba, umaabot ng 256 terabytes. Very powerful. And then 64-bit, It can run even 32-bit operating system. So, merong 32-bit and 64-bit na hardware, meron ding 32-bit and 64-bit na operating systems. But yung 32-bit, it cannot run an operating system at 64-bit. So, hindi siya forward compatible, of course. What's the use, no? And then, 64-bit is backward compatible. It can handle 32-bit operating systems. Now, actually, mga computer ngayon, mostly 64-bit na. Kaya they are more faster than, of course, you will see the difference ng 32-bit and 64-bit hardware. Now, another thing that we need to be aware of is the word clock speed and bus speed. Iba-iba ang mga speed from different models of CPUs. So, and of course, the faster the low, the faster the clock speed, it's more, better performance. And then yung front side ng CPU and system memory is another thing, another important performance factor that we need to be aware. So sa mga processor, meron din tinatawag na multiprocessing and dual core. Ito yung dito nang galing mga multitasking word, no? Multiprocessing. It's processing instruction set simultaneously, not actually at the same time. There's no such thing at the same time. Maybe with our senses, sa paningin natin o sa pandinig natin, they are working at the same time but actually simultaneous. Sabay mabilis, multiprocessing, and then hindi pa tapos yung isang hindi pa tapos i-execute yung isang instruction, meron na namang kasabay na isa na ina-execute. Yun ang ibig sabihin nun. And then meron tinatawag na symmetric multiprocessing. Ito yung mga tinatawag na multiple CPU sockets, multiple cores, na instead of single core or single CPU, sa isang chipset, meron dalawa sa loob. So usually, mga multi-cores, yun yung sa mga powerful hardware, mga server, maganda yun dyan. And then meron din tinatawag na CMP, chip level multiprocessing. This is more advanced, but just to let you know, ito yung meron ng more than dual core, meron ng 2 core, 4 core, 8 core, but you just see inside, merong isa lang, pero multi-core yon. 4 core, minsan naman dalawa, dahil isa 4 core, isa 4 core din. So, mga server to, ito yung mga marami, kasi isang core is isang processor. So, pag sinabing dual core or 2 core, yung isang processor mo, meron pang actually, physically, the one parts that you see inside the hardware, dalawa sa loob niyan, dalawang processor sa loob niyan, or 4 or 8. Ito yung mga engine, I would say. Mga dual engine, 4 engine, yung sa loob ng kotse mo. The same, something like that. That's the analogy. And then, in a computer system, meron din tinatawag na expansion bus. Ito yung mga where we insert the expansion card. Di ba yung motherboard, no, in system itself, or sometimes they call it system board, it's a electronic board, di ba? It's a printed circuit board. When we say printed circuit board, yung circuits, yung wiring, instead of wires, in connections, it's printed. Para siyang nakadrawing, no? And it's laminated. And even the buses, it is a printed circuit. So sa processors for data, no, and then the address, timing, and power, yan ang mga technologies that you will be facing, that you need to be aware actually if you want to be IT, when you need to have an IT foundation. And then yung system bus, yung eting sa harap ng CPU, and it's a path, or it's a data bus between the CPU and the memory. Yung expansion bus, ito yung mga another input and output bus, dyan yung tumatakbo. Ito yung between the CPU and other processor itself. Now, yung expansion bus, maraming types yan. No, starting from PCI, there is also an AGP, and PCI Express, and then meron pang PCIe. E stands for Express, and then 16-bit, and then PCIe 2.0, and then PCIe 2.0 16, and then PCIe 3. Ito yung mga expansion card. Remember from a drawing, di ba? Or so from the picture earlier, ito yung ini-insert ng mga small o mga small computers interface. So, pinaka-lowest level, yung PCI 32-bit, ito lang yung bandwidth niya, 133. Luma na yan. Those are the early days before. I mean, before the first time I heard that in PCI, wow, new technology. Until later on, a few months later, meron ng accelerated graphics port. Ito ginagamit yan sa graphics adapter only. Ano din siya, yung slots where you insert the cards, but it's for graphics. And then yung more advanced, more faster, yan na yung maraming PCI Express. Makikita nyo yung bandwidth niya, umaabot na no, from 250 Mbps up to 1 gigabits per lane. Yan ang mga changes o variations ng mga bagong model ng PCI Express. Now, another thing that you need also to be aware of is the system cooling. No, ano yung system cooling? Ito yung, guys, kasi, bakit may system? Yes, may system cooling palang CPU. Yes, meron tinatawag na heatsink, no? And then a CPU fan. Actually, di ba, you remember, ito yung CPU naka-insert sa CPU socket within the motherboard. So, dito naka-insert yung CPU, and then on top of it, merong heatsink and a CPU fan. Cooling system yan, guys. Ito, tumatakbo yan, umiikot yan. Minsan, yan yung maingay eh. May yung humming sound. And actually, those are the fans. Why? Because this is electronics still. Electronics pa rin yan with millions of transistors. So, when we say electronics, it dissipates heat. Sumisingaw pa rin ang init dyan. It is run by electricity. So, it is an engine actually. Just like an engine. No? And in electronics, na you don't want this component to be, it works, it will malfunction pag walang cooling system. Kahit man ang engine, pag nag-overheat, di ba? Nag-umihinto. No? Even on GPU, makikita mo may mini fan dyan. Very interesting. Makikita mo yan yung mga maingay. No? Yung accelerated graphics port. No? Processing unit. No? Meron yan. Flow din na parang, actually, it's a fan. So, yung heatsink, it's aluminum. Meron yung thermal paste na to fix, no, para hindi gumalaw, naka-fix siya, hindi naman permanent, natatanggal pa rin yun. So, yung heat dyan, it doesn't stay on the CPU, pero ina-absorb netong heatsink. Ina-absorb niya yung heat. And then, yung fan, habang umikot dyan, binubuga niya yung init. So, by convection, ina-absorb yung heat, and then yung fan, it blows the hot air, and then actually draws in a cool air. So, may circulation, may ventilation sa loob ng CPU. Hindi talaga totally sealed dyan. But there are cases na yung mga sealed talaga ng CPU. And those are for industrial purposes, mga ganon. Pero yung mga typical office or commercial-based computers, may mga may air cooling, may system cooling actually. Now, meron din tinatawag na na cooling system, yung liquid-based. Makikita niyo na parang engine talaga. Ito yung pipe, no, liquid-based, no? Yan, no? Yan, dyan na tumatakbo yan. Merong cooling na ganyan. It's less noise. No, instead of using a fan sa mga CPU, ito coolant, may mga coolant. And you don't do anything about it. No? It's part of the hardware and it's more expensive. Makikita niyo ito yung fan sa power supply na lang or for ventilation. Hindi yung unlike in typical heatsink with fan na sitting on top of each other. And then, now let's go to firmware. as if you remember from previous units, when we say firmware, these are programs that are actually running or directly installed sa motherboard, sa electronic mismo. It's different to software, no? And then ito yung firmware na an example dyan is yung BIOS. And then we the new ones is the I read this a WEFI. No, I read this as a WEFI. No, these are both actually by definition are basic input system. And that's what BIOS stands for. Para saan ba tong BIOS firmware? Para saan ba yung WEFI? That's for booting. When it runs a program as you power on the computer for initialization. What do you mean initialization? Para ano, to turn on some components of the motherboard or to run some programs to check the components if it is functional, if it is available, kung ano yung missing o kaya anong additional. So may mga checklist itong firmware na to na what should be within the hardware or what is being added, and then may mga program then that actually run or check the status of the hardware itself. So the moment you power on the CPU, yan ang marinig nyo until merong beep sound. Dati malakas pa yung sound na yan, talaga marinig mo na toot. Ibig sabihin yan, it's a good bootstrapping, it's a good booting. And if there's an error, you will have multiple boot sound, multiple beep sound. Minsan na a combination o kaya rapid sound. Usually, it pertains to memory o kaya additional card na you inserted. But again, when you turn on the CPU, it runs a program and then it checks the integrity upon initialization of the hardware itself including the components. So, naglo-load yun. Nagra-run yun within the motherboard bago yung operating system. Bago i-load yung operating system. So, when we say BIOS, kaya nga tawag sa kanya is Basic Input and Output System program. Chine-check niya lahat yan. And then, this is the early generation, early release ng mga firmware. They call it BIOS kasi menu driven, meaning you have to use your arrow keys to go to another menu to do something. And then yung WEFI stands for Unified Extensible Firmware Interface. Ito na yung graphical type. Ito yung graphical type. And you will see later on, no, ito. When you turn on a computer, may mga keys. Sa Dell computers, no, it's either F2. You press F2. Pag lumabas yung symbol, you press F2, papasok ka sa BIOS. It also called System Setup. May makikita pa kayo ng ibang services na for a server, for example, or mga ibang function like boot manager with different keys. But going back to firmware, to enter a BIOS setup or system setup sa Dell, you press F2. Ibang brand, it could be F10, no, like Compact or HP. And then dito, when you enter the system or the BIOS setup, yan, maalamin mo yung system setup, alamin mo yung memory settings, processor settings. You go there by navigating with arrow keys, and then you press enter. And then up arrow to select, or you move, or plus minus if you want a space, or and then here the other functions. So everything is with an arrow keys, and then enter or escape. And then yung mga keys, keyboard ang ginagamit to navigate. You cannot jump right away until you scroll down further. So ganyan ang itsura ng firmware that you have seen. Probably some of you. Now, yung WEFI naman, as I've said, is graphical. So aside from the mouse and keyboard, the mouse actually, you can just hover on each menu. Click and click, point and click ka na lang dyan. Yun ang ano nyan. And another, what's important as well is that may mga other features na hindi available sa BIOS because the WEFI is the latest firmware versions that you will be seeing sa mga bagong computers ngayon. And may mga features dyan na even for booting system na it doesn't interoperate with BIOS. Yung BIOS yun na actually ang tawag na yung mga legacy na yun eh. Legacy configuration ang tawag na doon. Now, in this unit, diba, we cover the system components. Yeah, it's a good discussion, diba? We explain, we identify each components and then its function and then its significance for performance. Through that way, you will be able to specify what computer that you'll be looking for personal use, for gaming ba, or for business use. And then, yung mga components niyan, diniscuss natin ano mga functions, where it is located, ano mga terminologies or specifications that you should be aware. And we covered also the cooling system, the significance of it. Kung saan yan, ano components niyan, and how it works. And then, of course, the firmware. There are two of them, diba? Yung BIOS and UEFI, that actually very significant in booting a computer to load the operating system. So I hope this has been informative to you. See you on the next unit.